at 6:15 a.m. on June 28, 1944. Technical Sergeant Earl Lawson stood beside a destroyed M4 Sherman near St. Lo, Normandy. 3 crew members had burned to death. The German 88mm shell did not penetrate the armor, but the hull weld split lengthwise from the top edge to the bottom, separating the entire front section of the tank body. Lawson, 32 years old, had been a welder at the Detroit Arsenal tank plant, where he had welded hundreds of Sherman hulls for the war. Now, he was watching his own work collapse. He bent down, examining the crack. 45-degree weld angle, even. Clean, matching every parameter in the Ordnance Department handbook. Speed of 6 inches per minute. Arc heat of 1,600 degrees. Natural cooling. Everything was correct. And that was what chilled him. The armor plate was not penetrated, not deformed. It cracked perfectly, as if someone had cut it with a knife. Lawson knew this weld. He could recognize his own handiwork at a glance. "The weld broke before the men had a chance," he said softly. He tapped lightly on the crack edge, the sound ringing out dry and sharp. This steel did not bend, it shattered. Technical documents called this damage from ballistic impact, but Lawson knew it was not. The weld should not have failed lengthwise unless something was wrong from the way it was created. He looked up at the line of Shermans waiting for repair, all welded by the same process, a process perfect enough to kill. In 1944, the M4 Sherman was the pride of the United States defense industry. 63mm thick armor, Continental R975 engine, top speed of 25 miles per hour, hailed as the democratic steel machine that could dominate every European battlefield. In the eyes of the American public, the Sherman was a symbol of mass production power. Each one born from steel assembly lines in Detroit, Cleveland, and Pittsburgh was proof of a nation's industrial might in victory. The Sherman's structure was monocoque welded with carbon manganese steel, following strict standardized procedures issued by the Ordnance Department. 45-degree weld angle, 1,600 kcal arc heat, torch travel speed of 6 inches per minute, natural cooling at ambient temperature. Everything was meticulously calculated. Every parameter recorded in coldly perfect numbers. In factory conditions, everything truly worked as written. Test armor samples at Aberdeen withstood 75mm shells without cracking, the steel surface intact after dozens of hits. Engineers wrote in reports, no observable fracture under repeated impact, but factory conditions were not war. In Normandy, amid mud, rain, gun smoke, and constantly changing temperatures, that perfection shattered. Lawson began noticing a strange phenomenon. Shermans hit by German 88mm shells, the type that pierced every armor, this time were not penetrated, but the armor broke. Cracks ran along the hull weld edges, splitting thick steel plates as if cleaved by a knife. When the armor broke, the explosion's shock force was not absorbed, but reflected back into the crew compartment, hurling the crew, crushing everything inside. Survivors said the impact jolt made them feel sucked into their own armor. In 3 days, Technical Sergeant Earl Lawson inspected 8 different wrecked tanks around St. Lo. He saw they all shared the same damage pattern, cracks always starting in the area around the weld, called the HZA, heat-affected zone, where steel was altered by high heat, then cooled too quickly. There, the metal was no longer structural steel, but had transformed into martensite, hard, shiny, but brittle as glass. He hammered each weld, hearing a dry, abrupt ring with no resonance. "This steel is no longer alive," he muttered. In his notebook, he sketched each crack, numbered them, recorded length, angle, position, and time of destruction. Every crack pattern was identical, starting from the weld origin, propagating straight, never curving. This proved it was not random bullet impact, but a systemic flaw. Lawson compared old designs from Detroit and spotted the difference. From early 1943, to boost output, the Ordnance Department issued a shortened welding procedure, eliminating the slow cooling stage. In the document, a note read, "Slow cooling step omitted. Productivity gain 28%. That 28% meant thousands of tanks shipped earlier, but now, on the Normandy battlefield, it meant death for those inside. Lawson took an armor sample from the burned tank, cut it with a torch, then examined under welding light. The cracked surface was gray-white, fine-grained steel with no light reflection, signs of overheating and rapid cooling. He struck a piece with a 2-pound hammer. It broke cleanly like ceramic. Each sound made him shudder. Lawson's report was 6 handwritten pages in careful script. In the conclusion, he wrote, "The welds fail from within. Cooling rate too fast." He sent it to the division's engineering office with a proposal to restore slow cooling. 2 days later, the report returned with a single cold red pen line. "Regulations are written in Washington, not in Normandy." Lawson read it over and over, then folded the paper and slipped it into his pocket. He was not angry, just cold. In Washington, they called it optimization. In Normandy, it was optimizing death. He knew the fault was not in the welder or the steel, but in the very perfection everyone worshipped. In the rear, they said buy the book. But in war, the book was killing people. In the 3 weeks after D-Day, the 2nd Armored Division lost 42 M4 Shermans. Initial reports noted briefly, destroyed by direct fire. But when Lawson saw them firsthand, he knew it was not true. Most of those tanks were not penetrated, no bullet holes. They split open, cleaving in half along the hull welds, armor, identical to industrial knife cuts. The German 88mm only needed to touch, not penetrate, just transmit shock that burst the weld, flinging the front armor plate like a hinged door. Inside, the soldiers had no chance. Lawson and the recovery team scoured St. Lo and cadences, collecting tank wrecks and bodies, bent frames, the smell of burned oil and human flesh mixed into black smoke, creating air thick as wet coal, black mud streaks on charred steel. Sometimes he wore a smoke mask, not for poison but for the smell of the very tanks he had welded. A surviving crew from Morton recounted, "We didn't burn because they hit us. We burned because the tank cracked." That sentence haunted Lawson through sleepless nights. He wrote it in his notebook amid technical notes. It was not a complaint, but an indictment. Each morning, he read loss reports. Every line the same. Crew error, structural fatigue, ballistic stress. No report mentioned the welds. To those above, it was just combat statistics. But to Lawson, each number was a man he had met, shaken hands with, welded the tank they died in. He looked at those impersonal lines like gravestones. At night, he saw the Detroit factory again. Thousands of workers bent over gleaming steel hulls, welding sparks like falling stars. Overhead, a big sign read, "Speed wins wars." He remembered the foreman's shout amid metal clang, "Faster, hotter, more welds." Those words once made him proud. Now, on the battlefield, they echoed in his head like an accusation. He told colleagues in the field shop, voice hoarse and low, "We're not building tanks, we're building coffins that move." No one replied. One kept welding, face lit in green arc light, as if unwilling to hear. In that silence, Lawson realized the most painful truth. Everyone knew something was wrong, but no one dared say. They feared losing jobs, charges of breaking rules, blame for what was not theirs. Each clung to one order, follow the process. Lawson began doubting what he once saw as religion. Absolute precision. If correct numbers were killing, what did correct mean? He tapped a charred armor piece, the ring dry, heavy, low like knocking stone. No resonance. Steel not alive. New Shermans heading to battle were still praised in newsreels, but Lawson knew they carried latent cracks. He wrote in his notebook, "Every weld that leaves Detroit carries a countdown. Each tank a ticking clock to armor failure." Returning to the shop after long days, Lawson sat leaning against a burned hull. And in that moment, he knew, to change it, he would have to break everything he once believed right. One evening in the field shop, after a long day recovering wrecks, Lawson sat quietly on an oil drum, clothes smoke-stained, hands still burned. Nearby, Jack Delaney, an old welder from Louisiana, sharpened a torch tip, a half-smoked cigarette in his mouth. Delaney had worked shipyards in New Orleans before the war, a man welding steel since Lawson was a kid. When Lawson described the Sherman armor cracks, steel breaking not bending, Delaney just laughed hoarsely. "You're welding them too perfect, kid. Steel that doesn't breathe will break." Then he told of an old shipyard process. "In shipyards, we used to cool welds with soaked cloths. Slow cooling makes the seam flex instead of crack." Lawson listened, eyes flashing. Slow cooling. Those words rang like an escape. In the Navy, they welded hulls twice as thick, enduring waves and heat, without cracking. Why couldn't tanks? Delaney shrugged, puffing smoke. "Ships can't afford to crack. They learned that after the first one sank. That sentence kept Lawson awake. Next morning, he returned to the shop early, took a 63mm scrap armor plate, cut it with a torch, and started testing. He set the torch 10% lower, adjusted arc to avoid overheating, then welded reverse, a technique he called back loop weld. When done, he took wet canvas, draped it over the weld. Steam rose, hissing. He sat waiting, watching thin smoke curls like steel breath. When the metal cooled, Lawson hammered hard. The weld only dented, did not break. He hit again, still no crack. For the first time in months, he held something in his hands better than the standards he once trusted. He recorded results in his notebook, then submitted a report to the Ordnance Section Field Engineering Office. 4 pages, clear. Modified back loop weld with slow cooling decreases brittleness by 35 to 40%. Recommend limited field test. He waited half a day. By afternoon, it returned with a red pen line from the engineering officer. Non-standard welding violates ordnance code. Do not repeat. Lawson stood still a moment, those words colder than steel. A colleague passing whispered, "Forget it, Earl. This isn't Detroit. This is war." He nodded but could not erase the image of the uncracked weld. He knew Delaney was right. Steel needs time to breathe. Technical rules forbade it, but human lives were not in rules. That evening, he and Delaney sat on the shop step. Distant German artillery rumbled like thunder. Delaney said softly, "You're thinking about doing it, aren't you?" Lawson stared at the cigarette glow, answered, "If I don't, someone else dies for it." They were silent long. Delaney sighed. "Then you better make sure it holds." That night, Lawson returned to his bench, flipped his old Detroit notebook. He reviewed every process line, parameter, not to be modified. On a blank page, he penciled, "Back loop weld, variable cooling, cloth wrap, field variant," then sketched reverse weld diagram. Added note, "If this works, it's no longer theory." He looked around. Shop-only generator hum and oil smoke smell. On the bench, the morning scrap plate, intact after 10 hits. He held it, tilted under light, saw the weld reflect gold like a silent lightning streak. In Lawson rose a feeling both fear and excitement, the feeling of one about to break rules, but knowing those rules were killing. The Battle of Mortain left an unforgettable chain of images. Dust, fire, and the small shrieks of armor plates under stress then splitting. Lieutenant Daniel Reeves entered the shop with red eyes and voice hoarse from smoke. He described the moment his Sherman was hit. One round spun him, the second cracked the weld like paper, and 2 crewmates vanished in a fire compartment without time to react. If that weld had held, they'd still be alive, Reeves said, eyes fixed on Lawson like seeking a reason to believe. Lawson did not answer. He just stared at the charred helmet on the table, paint peeling, rim smeared with ash, a simple but heavier witness than any report. Reeves left, leaving air heavy as lead. His footsteps echoed on oil-stained concrete. That evening, Lawson walked the wreck yard, amid dozens of Shermans lined like stranded ships, hulls peeling, armor cracked along weld lines, celluloid glass shattered, cables dangling, each like a mechanical mummy. And he, who had touched those welds in the factory, recognized his hand on every piece. Wind blew, carrying smoke and machine oil smell, and far off sky answered helplessness with thunder. Lawson listened to metal cooling in air, and whispered to himself, "If the right way keeps killing them, maybe it's time to do it wrong." That sentence was not impulsive rebellion, but the result of days counting wrecks, measuring cracks, seeing the same pattern repeat, welds done to every technical spec, failing before the tank took the hit, numbers on paper, standards proudly preached in Detroit, now like curses. Lightning flashed, reflecting on steel, revealing every pit, every metal grain altered by heat. Emotion in Lawson condensed, from frustration, through sorrow, to cold resolve. He recalled Delaney. Slow cooling makes the seam flex instead of crack, a method of those who welded ship hulls against storms, a trick deemed non-standard in modern military. If technology and processes in Washington would not change, he must do something here, on this ground, where men died for cleverness taught as innocent. Despair became resistance, not yelling at officers, not waiting for top decision, but action immediate with his own hands. Lawson returned to the shop, slow and deliberate. He opened the tool cabinet, checked the torch, remeasured current regulator, turned heat valve lower than previous scrap test. He rummaged spare parts for clean canvas to soak, prepared steel wire coils, and took a heat gauge to control gentle cooling. He knew risks. If caught, heavy discipline, even court-martial. If weld wrong, more die on battlefield. But he looked at the list of dead names, at impersonal reports calling it structural fatigue, and felt rule erosion leave him unafraid of personal consequence. Planning in his head, he assigned with Delaney, who watches, who pulls cover, who holds light, a small underground team trustworthy for night work. Everything prepared by welder rules, minimum safety for self, maximum for result. When the welding generator started, blue arc flashed, light reflecting in Lawson's eyes like a cold promise. He would place his hand between rules and comrades' lives, and if needed, accept all consequences to see if a slow-cooled weld could beat a hot bullet. On the night of July 24th, 1944, light rain fell, the drops tapping steadily on the tin roof of the shop like a countdown clock. As everyone stepped out to sleep, Lawson lingered, locking the first door, the second, then quietly walking among the silent Sherman hulls to select D-23, a tank he had once worked on, now scarred with a crack in the front armor. He placed the oil lamp at a safe distance, pulled out the welding cable, checked the gas cylinder, wiped the torch clean. Every action seemed routine, but the decision was not. Lawson adjusted the current regulator, lowering the arc power by about 10% from the issued standard, reducing voltage to avoid creating an overly large heat zone. In his mind was Delaney's talk of slow cooling, and in his hands was the technique he called back-loop arc, reverse loop welding to create a core metal layer that was not too hard but capable of bending. He planned the strategy. The weld path had to run slow. The overlapping seams had to be wrapped in the opposite direction from normal impact force, and each completed segment had to be covered with wet cloth for gradual cooling instead of open air like the standard process. When the current started, the blue arc flashed, each spark like a finger poking into the darkness. Sparks splashed against the shop walls, reflecting on other steel plates, making the space vibrate with a metallic symphony. Lawson began welding, hand moving the torch slowly, short paths, small loops. He curled his hand around the edge, turning the torch in a reverse arc, letting the weld eat gradually rather than rush, making the metal flow together more softly, creating a microstructure different from hasty hot welds. Sweat rolled from his forehead into his eyes. He wiped it with his wrist and continued. The crackling pops of metal as the arc touched the surface rang out steadily, almost like the shop's heartbeat. After each segment, he draped wet canvas over the weld, watching steam rise, hearing the hiss like the steady breathing of cooling steel. Where needed, he used a heat gauge to ensure the surface did not cool too quickly, trying to keep the cooling rate slower than industrial standard, but without letting water touch the weld directly. During the work, an armor-retaining pin slipped in his hand, fell and cut his fingertip. Blood flowed, dripping onto the hot steel edge. He stayed silent, pulled a knife, pressed the blood back, wiped with an oily rag and continued. The blood on the steel made him think. A drop of blood for every tank that broke, like a personal oath, a sign that this was the price he was willing to pay. Each weld corner was handled meticulously. Pull the loop, tie the loop, wrap the cloth again, count the beats, adjust the machine lightly. Time stretched, and worry walked with him. If an inspector saw the wet cloth coverings, if someone overheard welding at the wrong time, the consequence was court-martial, even prison. But in his mind was another street of words. If done by the book, more men would die. If breaking rules, a chance for some to live. He thought of the names already dead, the hands no longer there to grasp. That made the risk more bearable than waiting for indifferent orders. As the work neared the end, outside the shop was silent, only rain and the steady welding machine. Lawson finished the final connections, rechecked with a small hammer and pull test, eyes scanning every metal edge under the light. The shop's mechanical clock pointed to 02:10 a.m. When he sat down on the damp concrete floor, body exhausted, hands sticky with oil and blood, looking at the newly cooled weld, a dull silver band, even an elastic when tapped with a hand hammer. No stain cracks, no crack sound like before. He knew every step could be a legal error. He knew if this weld failed in the next battle, more would die and he would bear the blame. But right then, amid the smell of cooling metal, he felt something like pure responsibility. He had done what his conscience demanded. Lawson stood, washed his hands with gasoline to remove the blood, wiped on an old rag, then bent down to see his shadow stretched on the steel surface. A lean figure in the light, a figure standing between rules and humanity, a rule breaker but loyal to life. He clenched his fist, closed his eyes a moment to swallow fear, then gently cleaned the tools, returned the torch to its place, locked everything carefully. On the morning of July 25, 1944, dawn just broke over the Normandy bocage fields. Operation Cobra officially began. From the field shop, Lawson watched the Sherman columns start engines and roll out, gasoline smoke and dust rising into a white haze. In the vanguard was D-23, the tank he had rewelded the night before. On the turret was the white-painted snake emblem, the 75mm main gun pointed straight south of St. Lo. Lawson watched until the engine sounds blended with artillery blasts. Then he turned back to the shop, pretending to continue work as usual. All morning, the sky shook with bombardment. The shop radio caught intermittent frontline unit signals, voices mixed with explosions and static. Around 09:20, a signal officer ran in, shouting, "They've engaged German armor outside Marigny." The battle had started. On the battlefield, Reeves drove D-23 through thick bocage hedges, mud splashing both hull sides, air thick with gunpowder smell. From afar, 88mm guns thundered, the first shell buried in the ground before the nose, hurling mud and smoke. The second hit the front armor, sound like a thunder god's punch. The whole tank shook. The crew thought they were torn apart, but when smoke cleared, armor only dented, paint scorched, the weld remained intact. Reeves shouted over radio, "We're still moving." Armor held. D-23 kept rolling, main gun fired, took out a Panther on the first shot, then turret swung, hit the second as it turned its barrel. The third German shell hit the same spot again, but only created a small crack, no breach. When the third Panther burned, Reeves slumped in his seat, breathing hard, still hearing metal tick as it heated, but the tank did not break. He spoke over intercom, voice shaking yet laughing. "Tell Lawson his weld just saved our asses." In the shop, Lawson was cleaning tools when a second signal soldier ran in, face mud-streaked, shouting, "D-23 returned intact." No explanation needed. Lawson understood immediately. He stopped, looked down at his oil-stained hands and the small bandaged cut. The feeling in his chest was not pride, but a cold relief. He smiled faintly, a smile fleeting like cooling metal vapor. Welding light glinted on the table, illuminating the open notebook where the line "back loop weld field test" was crossed out in pencil. He took the pen, wrote one word beside it, "confirmed." On the battlefield, D-23 rolled through rubble, gun smoke and burning German wrecks, turret still lightly smoking. Reeves leaned out the hatch, wind whipping his face, midday light reflecting on the bright silver weld in front, where the 88mm round had stopped. That scene, no one recorded, not in victory reports, but for Lawson, it was the only answer he needed. In a battlefield where hundreds of things could kill, one slow-cooled weld had defied fate. The D-23 kept rolling through fire and smoke, armor scorched but whole, moving like a survivor in hell, symbol of the absurdity Lawson had just created. A small useless trick had saved an entire crew. News of the Lawson weld spread faster than official orders. After Marigny, maintenance teams in the 2nd Armored Division began whispering about a Sherman that didn't crack armor despite 2 88mm hits. They mentioned the welder on D-23, said he had done something different, a strange trick not in the handbook. In temporary shops along the line, the phrase became an underground password: "Cool it slow, wrap it wet, do it Lawson's way." Welders understood, no paperwork, no instructions, just exchanged glances and short nods. After welding, they draped wet cloths over joints, counted silently until steam dissipated, then removed before inspectors appeared. No records, no signatures. On paper, all was standard procedure. But in reality, the process had changed. In 10 days, over 150 Shermans were repaired or upgraded with this non-standard method. In repair yards along Cotentin, Delaney and a few of Lawson's trusted taught the back loop weld to new welders, demonstrating while whispering, "Keep it low, keep it cool." Each knew only a part, but all did it for the same reason: keep tanks from breaking, keep men from dying. In command, logistics officers noticed something odd in damage reports. In 2 weeks, tank fire loss rate from artillery dropped 37%, a number no one could explain. A captain engineer looked at the chart and asked, "How are they holding so well?" No answer. Only the distant welding machine sound, steady like a heartbeat in the night. Rumor said every shop had its own Lawson, a welder daring to do the forbidden. Command suspected process changes, but when inspectors arrived, everything was perfect. No wet cloths, no unusual traces, only bright, even standard welds. And after they left, the cloths reappeared. Armor cooled slowly, each weld done by hands more careful than paper orders. The narrator's voice low. In war, some secrets save lives. South of St. Lo, as night fell, field shops still blazed with arc light, welding flashes in the dark, reflecting on silver steel and welders' eyes. No medals, no reports, just knowing each slow-cooled weld was one more chance to live. In Normandy's silence, amid wind and molten metal sounds, the small flame named Lawson spread quietly, not in documents, but in the hearts of those who knew that sometimes, to save a life, you have to dare to do wrong a little. On the other side of the front, the first German reports began appearing in early August. At 11th Panzer Division headquarters, a technical officer wrote in the summary, "American tanks resist penetration unusually. Seams hold even under direct hit. At 88mm gun positions around Morton and Falaise, veteran gunners noticed something abnormal. They fired at the same old spots, same distances, but results differed. One gunner wrote in his diary, 'Our shells dent, but seams don't split. Their armor bends instead of breaking.' This contradicted everything they knew about Shermans, tanks that previously exploded after 2 hits. Wehrmacht officers believed the Americans had changed armor material. A report to Western Europe Command concluded, likely introduction of improved alloy or new tempering process. Analysts in Berlin even hypothesized a new composite armor of carbon and nickel, beyond German industrial capacity then. Orders went to frontline units. Recover Sherman wrecks for analysis. But when they dismantled plates, nothing strange. Metal composition the same. Thickness still 63mm. Only one puzzling point. Weld lines looked slightly different. Not deep, not rough. Surface smoother and brighter than usual. While German engineers tried material theory explanations, on the other side, Earl Lawson in Cherbourg kept welding. He did not know his name appeared in enemy secret reports with the note, "Unknown modification improving weld flexibility." Meanwhile, German soldier psychology shifted. From confidence in 88mm guns, they grew wary seeing Sherman's advance. An artillery lieutenant recalled, "They used to crack after 2 shots. Now they just keep coming." In weeks, the tactic of shooting weld joints, once a fatal weakness, was abandoned. Commanders ordered focus on tracks and turrets instead of front hull. A German officer sighed in a report. They learned to fear the seams. Those who called Sherman's Ronson, lighters, no longer joked. Tactically, it meant Americans could hold formations longer, counterattack faster. Strategically, it significantly reduced German confidence on the Western Front. Each unpenetrating shell, each surviving Sherman was a blow to Wehrmacht morale. In Paris analysis rooms, Allied intelligence noted a clear shift in German fire patterns. Frequency targeting Sherman front armor dropped over 20%. The war was turning, one weld at a time. The narrator's voice deepened, as if each of Lawson's slow-cooled welds was redrawing the war map. The Europe map in command hung marked with German retreat areas, red dots turning pale blue, along the Normandy, Le Mans, Paris line. No one there knew a small part of the change started with an anonymous welder, from a rainy night decision, and from a slow-cooled weld that made steel flex like human skin. In cigarette smoke and echoing footsteps of a turning war, Lawson's enemy realized what he had understood earlier. Nothing is more fearsome than a mistake fixed the right way. In September 1944, as the fighting in Normandy tilted toward the Allies, a series of reports from frontline technical units began drawing attention from the U.S. Army Ordnance Department in Washington. The numbers seemed absurd. M4 Sherman tanks on the Western Front suddenly had significantly higher survival rates, armor withstanding hits 40% better, and crew survival after direct strikes nearly doubling. An official investigation was launched, titled simply but baffling, "The Entire Technical Apparatus, Armor Endurance Anomaly, Normandy Sector. A team of engineers and materials experts was sent to Europe, led by Dr. Robert Langley, the Ordnance Department's steel stress analysis specialist. They chose Cherbourg as the first inspection site, due to the large number of damaged but not destroyed tanks there. Over 2 weeks, the team removed armor from 14 Shermans with intact front hulls, measured ductility, analyzed metal microstructure with portable microscopes. The results forced an emergency meeting. No changes in alloy composition or armor thickness. The difference was in the welds. These weld lines had entirely different crystal structures, more uniform steel grains, significantly reduced brittleness. Under the dim shop lights, Langley said a line later, recorded in the minutes, "Whoever did this, he understood steel better than we did." A 12-page report was sent to Washington. The conclusion was concise. Slower cooling improves ductility, reducing failure rate by approximately 45%. The modification appears field-initiated. An additional note at the page bottom, recommendation, adopt as field protocol under temporary designation, variable cooling weld. In October, the order was officially issued, renamed Variable Cooling Weld, Normandy Protocol. It was approved and disseminated to all U.S. armored forces in Europe, but made no mention of the inventor. No name, no unit, no origin note, just a field discovery. In Cherbourg, Technical Sergeant Earl Lawson was called to the command office. The meeting took place in a small room, just him, Colonel Howard, the battlefield engineering officer, and a faintly printed report. Howard read slowly, voice low. Headquarters confirmed your weld variation increased structural endurance. Official directive has been issued. He paused, then looked up at Lawson, half admiration, half warning. Whatever you did, Sergeant, it worked. That's all you need to know. Lawson only nodded. He did not say thank you, did not justify, did not take pride. Before he left, the colonel added softly, "Keep welding, son. Just stay quiet." That was the only reward he ever received. No one in the Army knew that Lawson, an anonymous worker from Detroit, was the one who saved hundreds of tank crew lives by doing the process wrong. The war continued. Shermans pushed deep into France, crossed the Seine, advanced into Belgium. Tanks welded under the Normandy Protocol became so resilient that German soldiers gave them a new nickname, die Unzerbrechlichen, the Unbreakables. Meanwhile, Lawson stayed in Cherbourg, welding broken hulls, cutting out old welds, replacing them with his back-loop weld, sometimes in silence, sometimes amid distant artillery. He did not know his invention was now standard procedure, and thousands of workers in Detroit were performing the exact technique he devised on a rainy Normandy night. He only knew that whenever a Sherman returned from battle with intact armor, another crew might have survived, and for Lawson, that was enough. When the war ended, Lawson returned to Detroit. He got a job at Packard Motors, a small factory producing car engines. No one there knew he had been in Normandy, let alone about variable cooling weld. His personnel file only stated, occupation, welder, prior service, U.S. Army 1942-1945. Every morning he arrived at the shop, turned on the welder, welded frames, exhaust pipes, sleeves always oil-stained. Sometimes, when colleagues asked about the war, he answered briefly, "I fixed tanks, that's all." It is said that every year, on July 24, the day he welded D-23, Lawson would stay late in the shop after hours, turn on the welding light just to watch the arc reflect on metal, as if talking to lost friends. No one understood why. In 1968 he retired, opened a small welding shop in his backyard, still working until his hands shook too much to hold the torch. No awards, no medals, only burn scars on his wrists. He died in 1982, buried in a small Michigan cemetery. Gravestone engraved simply, Earl Lawson, welder. No line about the war. Nearly a decade later, in 1990, at the Armor Restoration Museum in Fort Knox, a tank restoration team led by David Morton discovered a surviving Sherman from the Normandy campaign, serial D-23. When they scraped old paint from the front armor, one restorer exclaimed, just below the paint, near the weld edge, faint engraved letters, EL, July 44. Morton called the team over. They tested with a spectrometer. The weld had unusually high ductility and tensile strength, perfectly matching samples in the variable cooling weld, Normandy Protocol documents. A long silence enveloped the room. Morton said softly, "We found him." The restoration report noted, recovered hull shows field modification consistent with Normandy protocol. Initials indicate origin likely Sergeant Earl Lawson, 2nd Armored Division. At the exhibition opening, the curator read the introduction. One nameless welder changed how American tanks survived the war. Then he pointed to a black and white photo beside the armor plate, a man with kind eyes and a slight smile, holding a welding torch, a Sherman behind him. Below the photo, a simple caption, Earl Lawson, Detroit Arsenal Tank Plant, 1942. The host spoke slowly, voice deep and warm. Sometimes saving a war doesn't take a new tank, just the courage to slow one weld. In the afternoon light, the hall fell silent as if holding its breath. The last rays shone through the window, reflecting on D-23's bright silver weld. That light fell directly on Lawson's photo, making his face seem alive again, half in shadow, half in steel. The narrator concluded, he was just a man who bent steel, but in doing so, he made it human. No applause, only respectful silence. Somewhere, in the steel-like quiet, the soul of an anonymous welder seemed still at work, still joining metal lines, still stitching war's cracks with human hands. And so, Earl Lawson's legacy endures, not in textbooks, but in every bright silver weld on the hulls of machines that passed through hell and returned whole. If you love stories of ordinary people who changed entire wars, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next journeys. Thank you for watching. See you in the next WWII story, where steel, courage, and humanity meet again.